All right, let's get started with our homemade pasta. Homemade fresh pasta is actually really easy to do. Really simple ingredients, and you don't even need to have a pasta maker to do it. I'll get into that when I move into my pasta maker part there and talk a little bit more about like a pasta machine. But you can definitely do everything by hand. So we're just going to jump right into the recipe and the ingredients here. My ingredient list that I need 2 cups of flour, 2 cups of flour, 2 eggs, 3 tablespoons of water, 1 teaspoon of olive oil, and ½ a teaspoon of salt. All right, so let's just get into this. My 2 cups of flour. So with my steps here on my recipe, it says on a clean surface, make a well with the flour. So I'm going to do all of this on my countertop, my nice clean countertop I have. So 2 cups of flour. This is a recipe where you're gonna get your hands dirty a little bit. It's gonna be kind of fun. With that in mind, I should take off any rings. All right, so making a well with my flour. Well, what the heck does that mean? I have my 2 cups of flour on the countertop, and I'm going to just make like a well, like a little crater. So the rest of my liquid ingredients that I have are going to fit inside this. So you can see I'm using 2 hands, one to kind of push everything aside, the other one to kind of guide things. So I want to have, I don't know, kind of high, thicker walls if I can. But definitely you don't want really low walls. You want something with a little bit of a higher wall and then somewhat thicker. All right, so the next step here is that I'm going to use a measuring cup to mix the egg, water, and oil and salt. So my first 2 blanks are going to be egg and oil. So I'll use my measuring cup to get my eggs in here. Start with my salt, my teaspoon of olive oil, and then go to the sink for my 3 tablespoons of water. I'll just use my fork to whisk this together to break up the yolks, have somewhat of a cohesive mixture here. And now with my next sentence here that I'm going to pour the wet mixture slowly into the flour and mix with 2 fingers, you can use a fork, until all the wet ingredients is incorporated. So my blanks 3 and blanks 4, blank 3 is slowly, and blank 4 is flour. I'm going to slowly pour my wet ingredients into my flour. And do this somewhat slowly, because if all my wet ingredients will not fit into my flour mixture, that's okay. Just back off, start mixing this, and then we can start adding more wet ingredients as we need to. But if my wet is starting to already run all over the countertop here, don't keep pouring it. You can stop and add more later. So even though this is a project we're doing on the counter, we're not trying to make a huge mess. So it says I can use my 2 fingers, or I'm going to use a fork to start with here to incorporate the wet and the dry. It also says don't force the dough to take all of the flour, but enough flour so the dough ball isn't sticky. So my 5th blank is sticky. So what does this look like here? I'm going to use the fork like I said, and I'm just going to keep just kind of gently, I'm doing like a stirring motion. And as I'm doing this, I'm kind of like grabbing a little bit of flour from my well, I can kind of knock some of those higher peaks off into there. And I'm just going to start slowly making a dough. I have a little bust out here, so I'm going to put my hand there and kind of help create a little dam so it doesn't make a huge mess. And then you can see that I am using my other hand to kind of help stabilize things so I don't just get a huge giant mess. And as it starts to just take some of the flour and get more of a dough ball, you'll be able to get rid of the fork and use your hands, and we'll use more of a kneading motion. You can see another leak here. See if we can create a little bit of a dam so it doesn't go everywhere. So it's a little bit of a slow process at first, but you can see it's definitely starting to take somewhat of a shape. It's not super liquidy anymore, but it's definitely not like a dough ball yet. It'll get there. There we go. It definitely doesn't look like it's going to start running everywhere. It's getting more of a dough ball type, looking more like a batter now, I guess. A little runny still. Be a little bit more aggressive with adding flour in. All right, now I think I might be ready to get my hands in here a little bit more. And then remember that flour is going to help us, so it's not just gonna stick all to my hands, so that I can try to get some flour in there. And so I don't come in there with kind of bare hands. I want like flour coated hands, and then definitely like, see I'm putting lots of flour on top, so whatever I touch the dough, going to be flour coated. And then I'm just kind of doing that kneading motion like we did with yeast breads, kind of just adding flour and folding it on itself. And you can see I've got lots of extra flour on the cutting board or on my countertop here. And then remember that note that I don't want to continue to add. I don't want to force it to take all the flour that is on the table here. That's not necessary. There will be an excess of flour here, and that's okay. But I do want to make sure that this dough ball is no longer sticky, because I'm going to put this through my pasta machine, and I don't want it to gum up and stick inside my pasta machine. I want it to be able to roll through and not make a big mess in my pasta machine. So the other thing that we were talking about with yeast breads when we were kneading our dough in Culinary 1, if you remember, is that we want to kind of listen to our dough as we're kneading it and we're touching it. What is it telling us? Is it really tough? Is it really soft? Is it really sticky? What is it that we're feeling with our dough? With our pasta dough, we want something that's a little bit softer and not really tough. So as I'm starting to work this flour into this liquid, I'm noticing that it's kind of tearing a little bit, and it is becoming a little tough. Not a ton, but just a little tough. And it's becoming harder to knead. So what that's telling me is this dough ball has kind of just had enough for this moment, and I'm just gonna let this rest and let this relax. Because we are developing those gluten strands, we're kneading it. We added liquid to flour, so we have gluten strands that are here. So it's going to get tough. But just like I said, take your time and listen to what your dough is saying. If your dough is really soft and you're having no problem kneading, then no, you don't need to let it rest. But like I said, mine is kind of tearing. It's feeling a little tough, so I'm gonna let it rest. Anytime that you're not working with your pasta dough, I suggest putting a towel over it, just so it doesn't dry out. And you're just kind of helping protect extra air that's coming onto it. So leave the towel on it, let it rest until it starts to relax. And this can be 3 to 5 minutes. This doesn't have to be a very, very long time. I'm gonna let this rest, just kind of catch up on some dishes that I've already made. 3 to 5 minutes, I'll come back. And then once you touch it, you'll notice that it is relaxed. It's not going to be really tough and kind of resist your touch. So when we have that kind of resistance of touch, or when it feels like I'm kneading a bouncy ball, it needs to relax. So I'll let it relax, catch up on some dishes. I'll come back to it at 3 to 5 minutes. All right. So that really wasn't very long. Like I said, 3, maybe 4 minutes. I didn't create too many dishes, so it didn't take long to get caught up. And it definitely is a lot better. It's feeling more relaxed. It's not tearing. So I think I'm ready to move over into my pasta machine. It doesn't feel incredibly sticky. Any extra kind of moisture and stickiness I feel I'm going to be able to take care of when I'm in my pasta machine by adding lots and lots and lots of flour when I roll this through the pasta machine. So I'll get moved over to the pasta machine and then we'll talk about pasta machines or pasta rollers. Okay, so I've shifted sides here to get my pasta machine up on my countertop because it does need to clamp onto a side of the counter, and this side of my counter allows me to do it. I don't have enough of a lip edge on that side of the counter. Anyway, before I get started with my pasta rolling, I'm gonna get my pasta water getting to a boil. So I have a large pot here with salted water. Remember, when we make our pasta, we want to make sure that we're salting our water. Yes, I added salt to my pasta dough that I had here, but making sure that you have some salted water for your pasta is great as well. So salted water, and it's really, really full because I want to make sure that my pasta has a lot of room to kind of swim around. It's not getting crowded in there. I'm turning it on now because I really dislike having my pasta ready to go and then now I have to wait 20 minutes for my water to come to a boil. So I'm going to get it going now. If it does come to a boil and I'm nowhere near ready for it, I can always just turn it down, and then when I'm ready I can turn it back up, and it's going to come to a boil in a fraction of the time versus no boil at all. So let that go and keep an eye on it, turn it down if I need to. So I'm over here, I have my pasta dough, again under a towel, because I need to set up my pasta machine. I'm going to talk about pasta machines for a while, so I'm going to let this sit under a towel here. I have additional flour. All the flour that was on the counter when I rolled this out, I discarded, because there's usually some chunks of stuff like egg mixture that's kind of chunked up from the flour when I rolled this out. I don't want to use. So I'm going to use some fresh, clean flour to be using my pasta machine. My alternate to a pasta machine is going to be a rolling pin. So I'm going to show you that method as well. So you can just do this with a rolling pin if you have it. Bench scraper is going to be a really great tool for this as well. And then now a pasta machine. So pasta machine, I got this one like on Amazon, I think $40-ish, $45 maybe. So if you're into getting a pasta machine, like I said, Amazon's really great. There's a whole myriad price range of pasta machines that you can get. Like Michael's, Tuesday Morning, Home Goods, or places like that. Not Michael's, Ross. Places that might have discount kitchen appliances or things like that. That'd be a really good place to get an inexpensive pasta machine, because they don't have to be super expensive. You can check Goodwill, but I would double check that it is a working order and not full of like dry pasta crud. Just make sure it's in working order before you go buy it. But lots of different ways you can get a pasta machine. They don't have to be expensive, but you don't necessarily need one. You can use the rolling pin. That's how pastas has been made for centuries, with rolling pins before pasta machines were ever a thing. So what I have here with my basic pasta machine is I have 2 rollers. So these 2 rollers here are going to roll and press the dough out. I have, this is my gauge here to separate my rollers. So now you can probably see a little bit of gap between the rollers, versus when I push them together you can't really see much there. So that pulls the rollers and pushes them closer together. Then I have a crank that's going to crank and roll those rollers. This is the clamp. It's going to let me clamp it to my countertop so it doesn't move around as I roll it. It's not sliding everywhere. And then this guy usually comes with one of these. So this one's really wide for like fettuccine, and then something smaller, spaghetti-ish, linguine-ish type. I suggest that your pasta is really dry if you're going to go for something very skinny. You'll see why when I start cutting my pasta. And then I like to use like a really nice dry pastry brush. I really like the kind of like artificial hair ones. They work a little bit better because when I use this pasta machine, I'm not going to get it wet. I do not want to get my pasta machine wet at any time. I usually, like I said, brush it down with that brush. Might hit it with a towel, kind of, use a towel to flake off some goo that's on there. But I really don't want to get it wet because there's lots of pieces to this. So if there's moisture in here, it's probably going to rust. And then it's just going to usually get any flour that's in here. The flour is just going to, flour and water, right? It's just going to make a doughy, sticky mess inside my pasta machine. And I certainly don't want to do that. So before I get started, I'm going to use my pastry or my bench scraper and cut this in half. I want to use just half at a time. And again, the other half I'm not using is going to go on a towel. Get some flour, using lots of flour. So now, like I said, my rollers can go really close together or far apart. You want to make sure that your rollers are set to really far apart. I have like 6 or 7 pasta rollers here in the classroom, and they all have different adjustments, meaning like this one, the setting for far apart is number 7, but when I'm closer together, I'm going to be on setting 1. The other machines can be different to where my widest setting is 1 and my closest together setting is like 10 or 12 or something crazy. So they're all different, just you can visually check and see, okay, which one's the widest, which one's the smallest, more narrow. So do make sure that it is on the widest setting to start. And then before I even get my pasta in the machine, I want to do a little bit of hand pressing out because really the amount of space that's in here is not very much. So I want to give it kind of a little head start to get in there. The other thing I want to do is make sure that this is well floured, because this is still going from a very wide to a very narrow. So if there is any moisture left in, like stickiness left in my pasta, it's going to glom up and get stuck into my pasta machine. So starting out with it kind of hand pressed so it'll at least fit in there is good. And then as I run it through every section, I'm going to flour it. So make sure it's floured between every section. So I went ahead and set it to the next smallest setting. Run it through again. If you run your pasta through here and you notice that it's sticking to the rollers and it's just too sticky yet, what I suggest to do is cut the pasta off and continue rolling so it comes out. Don't go backwards. If you're going to go backwards, you're kind of just making more of a mess. It's just kind of the same as just keeping going forward. So like I said, if you notice that it's getting really sticky and it's sticking to the rollers, I would just use your bench scraper and kind of cut it off and then just finish getting the rest of that out of there so it's not making a bigger mess. So as you go, you'll notice that it's a little bit drier and drier. You may have to just not have to put as much flour between each section. Just run it to the next smallest setting, roll it through again, next smallest setting, roll it through again. It might need to start becoming a team project the longer it gets. So you have somebody to kind of help hold it because it is going to get quite long. If it is getting just too long, you can certainly use your bench scraper to cut it in half or thirds or something like that. If you feel like it's just too much or it's getting too close to the ground or something. So I'm on number 2 here. So I've got this one and one more to go. A lot of people ask me, well, how thin? How far do I need to go? How many times do I need to keep rolling this? I say it's personal preference, because how thick do you want your pasta when you're done? So if you want it to be a little bit thicker, you could stop now. Like I said, this is number 2. But I want it a little bit thinner. And then also consider that when this cooks, it's going to swell just a little bit. So when you look at this, you're like, oh, that's pretty thin, I like that. Just know again, like it's gonna get a little fatter. It's gonna take on some water, it'll get a little fat. So I'm gonna go one thinner, and then know that it will swell in my water a tad. And then that should be the perfect thickness. Okay, really long pasta. I don't think my camera width is long enough. This is doubled up and just about to my knee. Doubled up and just about to my knee. So it's definitely taller than I am. So now that I have rolled it to its smallest setting, I'm gonna go ahead and start cutting this one. And I'm going to do a fettuccine one. It usually just slides on the end. And then there's other sections for you to put your roller. So you're going to start rolling these. These ones that cut don't have the adjustable for thick or thin. These ones are literally just cutting it. So you don't have to worry about, well, what thickness am I doing? You already did that here. This one is just cutting. So because this pasta is longer than I am, what I am going to do is cut it in roughly thirds. So when I'm eating pasta, I'm not eating like 9-foot pasta, that I have pasta that I'm eating that's somewhat manageable. I could probably cut this one in half because that just seems to be a little long. So same process here. You're just gonna put this into the desired cutting side. Get your rollers to roll. Come on, little friend. And then out comes some fettuccine. So I like to kind of catch them and then peel them off one by one just to make sure that they have it in fact cut from each other, that they are cut separate pieces. If your dough is really sticky, that part is going to be really difficult. So you do want to make sure that your dough is not terribly sticky, because if it's really sticky or really thick, sometimes when you cut it, by the time you cut it and it comes down to the bottom, it's obviously next to itself, right? But if it's really wet and sometimes just really thick, it sticks right back to itself. So if it's wet and it's sticking back to itself, we need to go back and kind of add some more flour, maybe roll it a little bit thinner so that it actually comes apart. So that's why I kind of like to take these one by one, pull them apart, toss them with some flour. Flour again, it's your friend. You want to make sure that you're tossing everything with a good amount of flour so it's not sticking back to itself. There are pasta dryers. It kind of looks like a tree of dowels, so that when you were to roll your pasta out, you would catch it just like I am here, and then put it on the dowel, and then separate it so they aren't touching each other, and then let it dry for like overnight, and then you could have dried pasta, have it for a little bit longer. But the fresh pasta, I would say you would want to cook it that same day. I've done pasta overnight. You want to make sure, if you're doing fresh pasta, you're going to refrigerate it overnight. Do make sure that it's covered with a towel and then toss with lots and lots of flour. So make sure that you're protecting it that way. So I still have half of a dough ball here, but what I'm going to do is show you the rolling pin method. So I'm going to get this cleaned up, and really all I'm doing is just using this brush to brush off any excess flour. like I said, I'm not putting this under running water. I'm not even going to hit it with a Sani rag, because if everything's gone right, nothing is sticking to it. If you do happen to get like sticky dough in there and your rollers are kind of doughy, the best remedy for that is to just let it dry. Leave it on the counter, let it dry, and come back to it when it's dried. Maybe take a toothpick to it and kind of pick things out and chisel things off. Shake it out. You can kind of shake stuff out that kind of settles in the bottom. But really just letting it dry, and then you can chisel it off. So you can still keep it. Don't worry, like just because you've got dough on it doesn't mean it's trash. So you can definitely be keeping that. Chisel it off. So while I show you the rolling pin method, I'm going to let this, like I said, I'm tossing it with lots of flour. Let this hang out, again, covered. Now that it's cut, I still want to be sure I cover it. And because I'm going to roll it out, I'm going to need lots of counter space. I think I'll just cut this half in half. So if you haven't guessed it, lots of flour. Almost there. Okay. So the same process. You can just imagine it's just going to be a lot of rolling. And we want to kind of keep in mind that same kind of looking at our dough. What's our dough saying? Is it done rolling out? If we roll it out, does it just constantly kind of come back to its original shape? Maybe we need to just let it relax and come back to it later. So if it is just kind of being a pain and you feel like you're getting nowhere fast, let it relax, put the towel over it, come back to it later. Do make sure that you're kind of picking it up from the countertop to make sure it's not sticking. And thickness is, again, personal preference. I think that's pretty thin. I can see the flour dots on the other side of it. I could probably go a little bit thinner. You can't see my hand through it. Don't forget your edges. Edges are ones that tend to be forgotten and tend to stay a little thicker, so don't forget to be getting your edges there. And then now the main process, once you've gotten to the desired thickness, is we're just going to cut it. I'm going to use a bench scraper, so I'm not going to be using a knife on my countertop. If I had maybe a wooden cutting board, sure, I could use a knife. That would be great. I've got my metal countertop, so I'll just use my bench scraper. But the general rule is that we kind of just gently roll or kind of fold so that we can have even cuts, so I'm not having to cut that whole distance, right? So gently kind of fold it on itself, and then we can cut by hand. And you can see kind of that same thing as using a knife. I'm using this hand to kind of guide how thick they are. And this one becomes a little bit more labor intensive because now, once I have them all cut, now I get to go through all of the little bits that I've rolled, and I get to unroll them. So it's a little bit more labor intensive than the machine there, but it still gets us pasta. And remembering flour, so as we kind of get a pile going here, we want to start making sure that they're covered in flour. So my pasta sounds like, or my pasta water sounds like it's boiling. I'm not quite ready. I'm almost ready. All I have to do is untangle all these guys, and then everything's going to go into the water all together. So I can turn that down just a hair, so I'm not just kind of letting all my water boil away and kind of evaporate away. But I'm going to get all of these untangled, tossed with flour, mix them with their friends that I did here, and then we'll start talking about cooking them. All right. That one didn't quite get cut. There we go. So everything is all untangled. Again, tossing with lots of flour. My pasta water is boiling. All right, so now I'm ready to get things boiling. So let's go back to our recipe and where our blanks are at. So we left off with sticky because we want to make sure that our dough ball is not too sticky. Once dough is formed, pat into a disc and start working through the pasta machine. So our 6th blank is machine. Make sure to use plenty of flour in pasta machines so pasta doesn't stick inside the machine. I went over that. When you have your pasta cut into fettuccine noodles, toss with a little bit of flour so pasta doesn't stick. So your fettuccine or those thinner spaghetti ones. Like I said, the thinner ones, really, you want to make sure your pasta's rolled nice and thin and really, really dry, because they are so thin. Once they come out of the roller, they really want to stick back to themselves, like I was talking about with the fettuccine ones. So just be careful that your pasta is going to be really dry. It's not going to stick. All right, so then we're going to cook the pasta in a large pot of boiling salted water. So the last blank here is boiling because we're going to cook in salted water. Remember, our pasta is going to be in salted water. We're only going to cook for 3 to 4 minutes or until al dente. Strain and toss with sauce. So al dente meaning kind of like has a little bit of a bite, firm to the tooth. But remember, 3 to 4 minutes. Dry pasta really has a range of like 9 to 11 minutes to cook dried pasta. Well, it's dried, but since this is fresh pasta, that time is really, really short, 3 to 4 minutes. So I do have a large pot, and it's boiling, and I have a fair amount of pasta. So what's going to happen at first is just naturally I'm going to get my pasta in there. My water is going to drop its temperature, and it'll take a little while to come up to temperature and back to a boil. Not a terribly long time, but I do want to consider that. I also don't want to overcrowd my pan. So if maybe I did like a double batch of pasta, or I have a really large amount of pasta, I might want to do 2 pots or 2 cycles of pasta so I don't overcrowd my pan. So 3 to 4 minutes, really quick and easy. I do have a strainer ready to go because this isn't going to take a very long time. 3 to 4 minutes. I can always taste it. I always like to taste my pasta before it comes out of the water, just to ensure that it's good and done to my tasting, to my liking. Let's get a stirring device here. Make sure we're stirring that around a little bit. Like I said, I have my colander ready. Another good indicator is that when pasta is like floating, when it's all floating, that's a good indicator that pasta is done. Like I said, really the key is making sure you're not crowding your pan. Let's see. I'm not back to a boil, so I was at a boil. I can start to see it's going to come to a boil. It's starting to float already right now. But I want to make sure that I'm not going to overcook it. Just give this a few minutes and then we'll taste it. All right. I see some simmering bubbles. Everything is definitely risen to the top, really, really floating nice and tall. We're ready to strain. Like I said, I have a colander ready to go in my sink so I don't have to fumble with it. Get this strained off here. All right, fresh pasta, separates, it's not falling apart. If it's kind of falling apart and disintegrating, it can be overcooked, or it could be that it was rolled too thin, but still kind of resulting in overcooking, because really that's what's kind of happening. It's taking on water, it's kind of disintegrating. So just keep in mind you're boiling when you're cooking. It's not going to take very much time like dry pasta. Really, really quick. Make sure you're ready to drain when your pasta is ready. But that's it. That is fresh homemade pasta. 2 different ways. You don't need to have that pasta machine. You can do it with that rolling pin, and you're good to go. So hopefully you can get trying on some fresh homemade pasta.